Amen. Amen. So we're looking today at Matthew 18:15-22. And I've called it Releasing Grace and then Rethinking Conflict and Cooperation. And it's a well-known sort of passage if we read and study the Bible. Not least because it's only one of two occasions when Jesus actually uses the word church within his own teaching. We've touched on this before, that the concepts of church Jesus is addressing very often and regularly, but it's only in Matthew 16 and now in Matthew 18 where he actually uses the word church. So in lots of ways, when people are looking at how do we do church, they will come back to these verses because we're now into the words from Jesus about these things. And we often look at it as an issue of church discipline. And I hopefully by the time we finish, you'll see another alternative. You'll see a slightly different kind of way of looking at the situation. So anyway, I've kind of referred to it in those ways, rethinking conflict and cooperation. And before we kind of get into the actual verses, I didn't actually, sometimes I put them on the slides before we get there, but remember the flow of what we were looking at. The very verse just before this one, verse 14, is about not causing little ones to stumble. As we were seeing last week, we're in the flow of a passage where, which is kind of in many ways, the passages, the things have started with authority now being moving to the disciples. And that authority has moved in the person of Peter as he's confessed Christ in Matthew 16. And Jesus has now given him authority within church to bind and loose, to set the tone, to set those sorts of things. And in that flow, Jesus has raised the issue of the little ones and don't cause little ones to stumble, and his use, as we've looked at in the last few weeks, his use of the phrase little ones kind of encompasses young Christians as well as young people. It's those who in their naivety are trying to grow and discover and become something in their faith and not to cause unnecessary offence to them, to be cautious of those things, to be conscious of the fact that the angels, as he used that phrase, that their angels have access to the face of God. And so it's this passage, which, as I say, we often look at from a disciplinary point of view, is coming in the flow of that care that is being taught to disciples who are growing in a place of authority and duty, if you like, duty to their mission, but then authority over that mission. And that's an important kind of, if you like, reminder to put in place, because as we're going to see, what Jesus is actually doing is he is putting a thoughtful process and a constraining process on the exercise of an authority which the disciples are naturally growing in. And you kind of start to put these verses, we're going to look at them, into that kind of context. It comes out very clearly. So say we've just been having this passage about not causing unnecessarily stumbling, by not patronising, not talking down to, not kind of dismissing the opinions of those who are growing and young in faith. We're going to go on to thinking about the way that our own knowledge of what we've been forgiven of ought to make us far more gracious in the passage we'll look at next week, which we won't get on to today. So I'm putting it all into that sort of framework. So verse 15, now, if your brother fails in duty towards you. So you'll often see, I think the King James uses the word trespass. When we do these Bible studies, I often put my own little translations, not because this is a better translation, but because I can create certain kind of contrast just to make us think about something a bit more broadly. So the word, which I think some translations just have sins against you, see, but it's very clearly it's the kind of stepping outside. It's the actual Greek starts, just trying to remember how it goes. It starts with the A, like is in atheist, i.e. the opposite of someone who's not a theist, and then it's about an appropriate or a portion that should be allotted to you. So the word here that is translated very often as trespass or sin is that someone's not behaving towards you in the way they ought to, and I think that's an important thing. because we're going to see here that these verses, which have often been used to kind of create a discipline structure, are not an all-encompassing discipline structure. They are much more, as we're going to see, about the place of conflict of opinion, particularly around matters of importance, maybe doctrinally and so on, but also pastorally as people are trying to work those things out. And so if there is someone who is failing in kind of giving things, understanding things the way they ought to, but it's very, very clearly also a reflective thing. It's towards you, although that's sometimes missed. I think it's in the King James. It just says, if your brother sins, and it hasn't got towards you. It hasn't got that reflective bit. So Jesus is speaking to his disciples, and he's kind of talking about, you're dealing with a group of folks, and now some of them aren't giving the authority to you. They are not giving you due portion. That you could translate that as sins, so it's not inappropriate to. It's just I want to kind of get across that idea of your eldership. They're not treating that seriously. They're maybe not listening to you. Show them his fault privately, or between you and him alone, I think is the kind of literal, if you spell it all out. But the implication of all of that is you're doing it privately. So where there is this place of conflict, part of the way we try and do our maturity in Jesus in a way that isn't patronizing, in a way that causes stumbling and upset for those who are younger and less developed in their faith. And there is a part of why I'm perhaps trying to spell it out in this broader sense is there is a broader sense of the kind of what Jesus is addressing, which is not strictly just only relating to real moral indiscretions. We're not talking about how you might discipline someone who is a serial adulterer. We are the kind of the phraseology and that is being used here has quite a broad kind of context. And seeing the breadth of that makes us realize why to interpret Jesus's words he's going to give us as to how we kind of take people through a process on this in the harshest kind of way is a kind of inappropriate way of doing it, because it's a broad sense of we're trying to grow together. We're trying to do it without a kind of a hierarchical structure like the world does it, in a much more cooperative, relational, family, learn together approach, which was supposed to be embedded in the synagogues. But of course, people rise to a position and have an authority that relates to that position within those places, and it can get very kind of push you in, include you, cut you out. And we looked a couple of weeks ago at how that phrase about binding and loosing is all about those that have authority over the culture of a synagogue, and we find that in the rabbinic writings. So that those who are in that position, we're trying to exercise with grace. So if your brother fails in his duty towards you, if he trespasses against you, if he sins against you, show him his fault privately. And if he listens to you, you've won him back. So there's a very kind of simple process here, which if you applied this in the modern world, sometimes I kind of, you look at things and somebody will post something on Facebook, and then you'll get a kind of almost angry polemic back being posted by somebody else. And these can be Christian churches being affected by the culture of the world in very simple ways. And so I've seen things that I find really frustrating, because I think, because I try and have quite a broad spectrum of folks that over the years I've related to. So I don't agree necessarily with all of their theological positions, some of which I think are actually quite, in their sort of, under the guise of super grace, they're actually sometimes really unhelpful. So I've often seen people raise things, and I've actually sat there and I've typed out a response that everybody's going to see, and I've looked at it and I thought, do you know what? I need to do this privately. and then I literally click back, delete, and then just drop in a quick message to someone with a question or I'm just sending this to you privately. I think if you look at this, you'll notice that the word doesn't say this. I've literally, that's almost the word for word one of the things I once said to someone. They were making a statement very boldly, which kind of was very permissive in their understanding of it, and I just highlighted to them, but the key thing was if you don't do it privately, you have the opportunity of someone saying, "Oh, okay," and they actually withdrew the post. Whereas if I'd done it publicly, you think to yourself, "Well, actually, what I'd done, I would have escalated something." Because now others who didn't necessarily like what was said, but couldn't necessarily explain to the person. I'll tell you what it was, just to give you an example. Someone was making the statement that the Aramaic that Jesus would have used when he talks about eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom, that actually. That this meant this was about homosexuality, and here was Jesus endorsing and also transgender issues that came out of it in his way of understanding. You see, so I actually got out, and I have at home. I have an interlinear translation from in Aramaic Hebrew of Matthew's Gospel. So I went and found the exact verses and actually took the word, pushed it through Strong's, and actually wrote it back to them. But it was all done privately. And as a result, he withdrew his kind of comments. And while he may still hold those privately, at least he's not propagating them, if I can say it. Think of it like that. So I do apologise. It just sounds like I'm we all have our abilities to understand and see things and how we deal with people. Do you win people back? Do you win them over? I doubt that he fully was won over, but at least you've gone some of the way down those things. And I think that's the heart of what Jesus is driving at here. But if he won't listen to you, so now there's the next thing. So you start privately. And if he won't listen to you, then take one or two others along. So that, and now again, I've chosen a word that doesn't have to be this way, but just to try and illustrate it. Every talked about matter. The actual Greek word that is used here is rhema, which is an uttered word. In charismatic or Pentecostal circles, we like the word rhema because it's every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. It's got its now sense about it. But you're going to see that it's often the thing that's being discussed or debated. So so sometimes you'll see it translated as matter. You may not realise it was the word behind it. Sometimes you'll see it as word. But it's the things that you're kind of talking about and debating about. And in actual fact, rhema is a very appropriate word in the Greek for the kinds of utterances which we're going to come to, which are about how you set a culture within a church congregation, and that was what was in view when Jesus has talked to Peter a couple of chapters back about the authority he will have within his church. Now that Peter is able to listen to heaven, that you are Simon, who's Peter, but now you are Simon, but I call you Peter. I'm going to call you the Rock because what you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. What you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven, and so on. That place of authority that is now coming is often expressed by the things that the things that you decide you're going to talk about. That you're so in the kind of in the most legalistic way, you can translate the idea of rhema as a kind of a doctrine or a word or something that is being done within the church. But at the broader end, the other end, it could also be just the very stuff that people are debating and discussing. You see, so the kinds of things that are kind of in our culture, what is it we want to address? How are we addressing it? So I start by trying to bring my own maturity into the mix and express it in a private sense, because we're not trying to score points or win arguments. We're trying to win hearts. We're trying to bring them back. If that's not working, take one or two others. But now Jesus, so that every talked about matter may be established by the mouth of two or three witnesses. So Jesus is now drawing on an Old Testament principle. And as part of that, what it doesn't say here is find two people who already agree with your position. But there is a kind of a sense of which the people we're taking in, we're going to talk about it in a genuine dialogue way, but they are going to be witnesses to these things, and they're going to be the ones who kind of establish the truth of the word. So to kind of perhaps illustrate why I think we should take it this way, I've just pulled together some verses from the Old Testament that kind of relate and then also their use in the New Testament that relate to this idea of the 2 or 3 witnesses. Now, let's go back here. Just kind of, there we go. Yes, so the 2 or 3 witnesses. So Deuteronomy 19, verse 15, one witness shall not rise up against a man for any iniquity or any sin, in any sin that he sins. So if it's just me, for the sake of peace and cooperation and togetherness, I hold my tongue. But at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, at the mouth of 3 witnesses shall a matter or word. See, it's the same idea. You'll see certain translations put the word matter, even though the Hebrew is different from the Greek, but it captures the same tension. So a matter or word shall be established. So in this context, the sense of the word is probably almost the accusation. We find the same thing then kind of being picked up by Paul. So this principle of 2 or 3 witnesses being involved, so that it gets it away from kind of private, from individual accusation and response. First of all, don't do anything unless it's actually against you. If he sinned against you, if it's something that don't do it by hearsay, just because I hear somebody is. But actually there's something going on, and now I've got an opportunity to try and deal with it privately. If that's not working, I'm taking those with me as witnesses who probably will come to a similar conclusion, but not because I've lined them up to stand alongside me. They've got to be independent witnesses. Because it's a kind of a serious situation, but someone to kind of, so we're hearing the whole case, we're hearing the whole thing together. If you come back, some other things. So, for instance, Paul goes on and says, you don't receive an accusation against an elder except by the word of 2 or 3 witnesses. This is kind of taking it another stage, turning the whole thing over. Very often, and it's unfortunate, there is a temptation to misuse power and misuse authority. But actually, if we're going to take those things seriously, we have the same thing coming up from below. So it's a two-way process. There are those who have some maturity, and this is how they should need to behave. I think that's the case when Jesus is saying it, because he is saying it to a group of disciples, and a group of disciples who, as we're going to see, are growing at the moment. We're on the journey to moving from the 12 to the 72. So in the next chapter, Jesus is going to move down to Judea from Galilee. And we read in Luke's gospel, it's shortly after he gets down to Judea that he sends out the 72. So there's a kind of a multiplication of leadership and eldership and leadership authority moving from Jesus now to his disciples. In this context, he's kind of challenging those who are already in that high priority position. Now, when Paul is talking about it, he's also talking, of course, that eldership is not immune from the accusation, but likewise, we're making sure that it's not just one-on-one. It's not my opinion, your opinion. There's something that we can be real and tangible about here. We see the same kind of tension again, or the same contrast drawing from Deuteronomy and being reinterpreted in the New Testament. This is a slightly different verse. It's slightly earlier now from the previous one, Deuteronomy 17. At the mouth of two witnesses or 3 witnesses, he who's to die will be put to death. It's got to be happening there, and that idea is picked up by the writer of the Hebrews, who I tend towards seeing as Luke now. I've got my reasons, but won't say them here. A man who disregards Moses' law dies without compassion on the word of 2 or 3 witnesses. So that's a reference back. So here the writer of the Hebrews is looking back, saying we have this principle of the 2 or 3 witnesses. The man who disregards that in the Old Testament, dies on that account. Now we're in the New Testament, but he talks now here about actually how much worse do you think the punishment will be for the one who has trodden underfoot the Son of God. So Jesus has brought a testimony, he's brought a word, and counted the blood of the covenant, so mark that one, with which he was sanctified as an unholy thing, and has included, and therefore has insulted the Spirit of grace. And I kind of put those three little marks in that mix. In the New Testament, this again, we've got this same cooperative principle being brought to how the law is expressed, or how the legalities of our community are being expressed. But the thing I want us to see is that they are not to bring extra force, but they are to bring extra consideration into the mix. The witnesses are to so that we don't throw these things around too casually. But here in Hebrews, we also see something which we again see in the New Testament, which is that the witnesses aren't always necessarily people. So I think that the Son of God, well, Jesus came with a message, and he was willing to die for that message. So blood of the covenant suddenly becomes something I should take seriously. And he's and actually then he's sanctified by that blood, but also then by the indwelling of the Spirit, which is the Spirit of grace. When all of those things have kind of drawn together. So it's not just someone's opinion, but there's a wider testimony going on, and that idea of the wider testimony. The reason I wanted to see it kind of being referenced in the New Testament, referring back to the Old, is I think it's an important principle within the growth of the church. The place of we are not individuals who are trying to be perfect and making others marvel at how perfect we are. We are trying as a community to go somewhere, just as the original community that the law was delivered to by Moses, we're going to need to be shaped over several generations. They did not do well during the period of Judges once they got into the Promised Land, because it takes time for transformation to happen via, if you like, the seeds or the leavening influence of the covenant. And so it's going to be the same way within a church situation, and the focus needs to be on what holds us together. Therefore, it's not about it's not in the authority of the individual to put people down, shove them out, but in a kind of that cooperative sense. We then find again this idea that the way we understand and see and discover truth isn't something that hangs on a single word. It hangs in kind of the sense of an agreement, and sometimes those things are a little bit more supernatural. So there are three who testify: the Spirit, the water, and the blood. And so here we got this idea that we're trying to work towards a pure faith, but we are impure people trying to express a pure faith. But actually there's strength in going through the waters of baptism, understanding and praying the acceptance prayer and the sacrificial work of the blood of Jesus over you, and trying to lean into the Holy Spirit. Any one of those things doesn't guarantee any of our perfection, but somehow as we work with those things, we have greater faith that we're being led towards truth as we try and work them out as a community. So if we receive the witness of men, the witness of God is greater. And this is God's testimony, which he has testified concerning the Son. The issue of inspiration and authority in the church is a kind of a multi-layered kind of multi-referencing sort of approach, and I think you kind of capture that in this verse. And I have a kind of strong conviction from the way that Paul, for instance, treats the church in Thessalonica when he's had to leave it after only a very short period of time, but he expresses great confidence that those who have started by the Spirit will continue, and so on. That actually there's something about, okay, if I've taught you how to kind of lean into the Holy Spirit, and you've got your scripture, and you've gone through the waters of the baptism, so you've said something to God by baptism, I want to be buried by Christ in you, and I know we understand the power of the blood in our conversation. If we got those things, then we may make mistakes, but we're fundamentally going to be heading in the right direction. So we kind of, that was a rather long sort of sideways thing to say that there's an important Old Testament principle which is to do with how we try and keep the law and how we apply it to people, and we don't apply it too quickly. We make sure that it's fully understood, and we try to do so in a way that allows a certain level of independence. And part of the way we do that is including other people rather than it being in the hands of a single judge in the mix. speaks. And that doesn't matter whether you're a leader or whether you're a member of the church trying to establish, and maybe I'm not being treated well by an elder. But however we're doing it, we're trying to do it in a way that draws in the understanding and agreement of the community. But anyway, so if he neglects to listen to them, so that's the two that have come, then you speak to the church. And if he neglects to listen even to the church, then let him be to you as a Gentile or a tax collector. That little phrase, Matthew uses the word tax collector a couple of occasions, because of course it's his own profession. But a kind of a thing just to kind of remember again as we look at this in the terms of grace is that neither tax collectors nor Gentiles were 100% excluded. It's just to do with the intimacy of community. These are the kinds of rules that do belong in the rabbinic writing to the authority that is there with those who lead a synagogue, which is Jesus is now kind of reapplying and giving to his disciples. So some synagogues allowed Gentiles in for quite a lot of the way, and others kind of kept them at quite a distance. So in the same way that actually a synagogue community had some flexibility that laid with those who had authority to bind and to loose and to set things in place. And in a similar way, probably they did the same with tax collectors. Colin was just referring to the watching The Chosen. I quite like in that programme the way they've played Matthew. As I say, I've got slightly different views on some of my perspectives of how certain characters work, but I like the overall approach. And you get that sense in which Matthew has been excluded from kind of the synagogue life. But that won't be 100% true. But these are the kinds of things that we find actually belong to those who have the authority to bind and loose. How do you fit them in? So now we're moving from we've tried to work it out. It's a genuine sin failure. It's not just a disagreement about things. We try to work those things out. We've tried to win the person back. They're not listening anymore. There is a wider sense where we want to put the conversation that's being had here to the wider church. If the church is in a place where now we're in that kind of place of agreement, we've got to work out how we treat them. But there's someone whose views and opinions may not be healthy for us as a church, just as a Gentile who comes in and sits in. And we encounter those through the book of Acts, often as God-fearers who give to the synagogue, who are involved in certain things, but they can't eat with the synagogue and they can't participate in the discussions, but they can listen in. They can be in with us in those ways, and we can set those rules according to how the church is doing and the health and so on. We do those ways, but we, in some way or other, the community is protecting itself from, if you like, the free reign of ideas that may actually be destructive for them. And the issues are very real. These are awkward verses when we come across them because we love the inclusion, and this looks like it's exclusion. What I want us to kind of see is the exclusion is not arbitrary. It is a process, a managed process. But there is a need sometimes to do those things. I've been around in leadership circles long enough to have come across all sorts of things. Some of them are very kind of concrete sins with serial adulterers who, I just can't help it, I keep doing it, but it destroys families. So actually sometimes there is a place where we have to, in church, exclude those folks. So actually now our context is, this is too destructive. Of course, Paul talks about that it's in Corinthians, is it? Where he talks about the man who's in a relationship with his mother, and even the Gentiles don't do that. That's kind of now, becomes unhealthy and unhelpful to you. But then the flip side is you kind of go through, there can be smaller issues which normally you can win through. Anyway, let's get on to the end, because the end finishes nicely, finishes positively. So truly I say to you, whatever you should bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, and whatever you shall loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. And so again, we're finding this language of binding and loosing, which, as I say, puts it very clearly in setting the culture for the church, because that is really what is at stake here is not so much, if you like, the disciplines, it is the culture. You are protecting the culture rather than punishing the person. We are trying to focus on creating a healthy culture within the broader community. And actually certain ideas that actually have actions related to them can be destructive or on so on. And we need to set those things and be in agreement on it. But there's an interesting thing within the words that Jesus uses here, because so first of all, he's putting it into that cultural context. But you can read this in two directions. You see, if you're kind of doing it well, then what you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. Hang on, yeah, that's right. Okay. So he's reminding folks that there's something that it's important about them getting this culture right. Because they are the wave of disciples, perhaps pushing to the 72, who will be establishing churches all over the place in a year or so's time, and actually to understand that they have a responsibility for the culture, and the way the culture is working is often by the agreement of the community. It's the two or three who kind of we all agree together against here. So that's how things now it's to the wider church. And so the wider church now have come into agreement that this is the way we're going forward now, understanding of this rhema, this matter, this word. This is how we're going to do it. And if you don't want to do it, then you're a bit like a Gentile. We may not 100% exclude you, but you're not there in the heart of things, or like a tax collector might have been, who we feel kind of has sold out to us. So we don't allow you too much to set the direction and set the flavour. Now, I'm not talking about the absolutes of salvation. I'm talking about the behaviours we need to put in place for the sake of community. So then he says, truly, now, so if I've bound a certain thing, so you will find, and I think it's to the benefit of the church that you will find very often local communities, local churches will have different rules on different things, some of which seem kind of trivial, like how much noise the kids are allowed to make, and others might be a little bit more, seem more important, like, what's our status with unmarried couples who are living together, and some churches might say, we'll do this, and others will say, we'll do that. I'm not trying to make judgments on the calls that people make, because this is part of the journey of working out and living out church life together. But to understand that the culture we set will actually loose something, and certain things will get loosed within the church and other things won't be. And so, in my pastoral grace, we'll say we will allow this because the community we are working with are coming from this position and trying to get them towards this direction. That means we have a lower standard than one which is already starting here and moving there. This is a very real debate when you have kind of Jewish people who have certain moral behaviours that are much better than the Gentiles who live with them. I was watching an interview with Tom Holland, the classicist, who's saying, in the Roman world, a Roman citizen there was no legal complaint against him if he had sex with anybody he felt like. And that's not the same as the world that we think we live in the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment doesn't actually inherit Roman values; it inherits Christian values. You see, that's the point he was making. But Paul wrestles with this all the time. The issue that the behaviour standards here are a very different place. So we might set a looser standard here than we would if I was over there. It's not about salvation. It's not because you do this you get saved. But actually in your salvation, if we're going to go somewhere, we have rules of community, rules in church. And to recognise that if I've loosed this here, it might eventually become a problem to me. It's been too loose. Nobody moves on from that. So we never change or go somewhere. And I love this little phrase. We use it in church. We talk about we're quite happy to talk about belong, believe, and become. But it's really important you don't lose the become. So if you belong. And very often you belong, you start to discover what people believe and you start to change the way you believe. if we remove the become from things, then actually nothing changes. But if we make it as an expectation that as you kind of are changed in the way you see it, you become something else, well, that's good. So that's the kind of the approach which I think is healthy for a church, but to recognise that what it is we start with, what we've loosed, does affect the community, and so on. So how do we change? Anyway, we then get this little phrase. So I say to two of you, if truly I say to you that if two of you on earth agree concerning any talked about matter, that they shall ask, in other words, it's part of their dialogue, what should we do on this? It will be done for them by my Father who is in heaven. So the it shall be done for them, it seems to tie in with this idea of what's been loosed on earth will have been loosed in heaven. There is a kind of a grace where if you come to a conclusion, and I've used this example before, as your missionary work, if you've come to a conclusion that because we're working in a culture where people just wear a grass skirt, and so we will set a modesty level at this level, actually, if that's what you really all agree on as a community, there's a grace in that within heaven. But then equally, it's not wrong when somebody else comes in and says, but we're going to set up our church, but we're going to have higher standards of modesty, and we're going to do those things. And hopefully between the two, as people move from one community, move up to the next and so on, there is an uplift of behaviour and a moving towards what are the absolutes of God's standards. But we're doing so in cultures and communities that are kind of edging their way towards it. But the principle I see in this is that the Lord puts greater emphasis on the unity of things than he does on their absolutes, if I put it that way. The problem is very often we turn what should be a kind of a pragmatic cultural inclusion issue into a kind of this is the standard that God has. So I'm thinking about I'm choosing relatively non-controversial subjects, but they can be applied in a more modern sense. But in the past, we'd be involved in evangelism. You'd have a couple who aren't technically married, but they've got 3 kids and they've been together for the last 20 years. And there's normally a lot more kind of sense of when we allow them that position. As they go through their discipleship process, they may eventually get to a place where now they recognise, okay, now I understand and I agree with what you're saying, that actually there needs to be that level of commitment. We need to acknowledge it because we need the help of the people around us. We need the internal help of when we've committed something before the Lord, we'll stick with it. So all the evidence shows when you go through that process, you do stick with it more. So now I accept that and we move on. But actually, we can only do that if, in one sense, the community understands that process. We've got to that place of agreement. And if it has, there is a kind of a sense in which I think what Jesus is saying is your Father who is in heaven works in those ways. You set those boundaries, you've done them, and so on. But I'm very cautious because what I absolutely am not saying is, therefore, set it as low as possible. Because that isn't, I think, what's going on here. But what I think is about how the process works, how we lead forwards, what we've allowed, what we don't allow, how we shape people and try and win them over towards the process we're going into. And then Jesus kind of gives us that wonderful verse, which is one of my favourites, where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am in the midst. So in this context where he's talking about church and the inclusion of church and trying to make it gracious, we mustn't forget that now Jesus is with us. So it's not just our opinion and we go to the lowest point. We try and stick with his values. We try and stick with the things he's taught us, and he has very high values, very high approaches to honesty, sexual behaviours, all of those sorts of things. He's in the midst of us. Even if in the mix of stuff, we've kind of, as a group, we're going this way. I do feel like I've made a rod for my own back and kind of trying to share, I think, what is a complicated tension between that grace and truth. But then there's this nice little bit, we kind of finish with this. Then Peter came to him and said, so how often shall my brother fail in duty towards or against me? It should be, so I should have chosen just one of the words there. I put both of them, towards or against. And I forgive him as much as 7 times. And Jesus answered and said, I don't tell you as much as 7 times, ... but as much as 70 times 7. And the thing I take from this next little kind of dialogue in the mix is that what Jesus is trying to say is, when it comes to that place of grace and forgiveness and what we tolerate and how we try and shape it, we should err on the side of grace. We err on the side of grace. Now, it's interesting, he doesn't say as many times as is needed, but by saying 70 times 7, what he's saying is, if you think that's how gracious you ought to be, there's probably a point where you need to be more gracious and more forgiving and more tolerant. So remember, this whole exclusionary process is kicked off because actually I've got something that I need to forgive, and we need to kind of deal with it. Forgiveness is needed here. So this all kind of relates. In this process, how often do we need to be tolerant and forgiving? Well, the answer is more than my best guess is going to be. But that's not the same as absolutely all the time, because there are kind of limits whereby, as we mentioned, the situation, if you've got someone who thinks that actually, because Jesus said, I'm choosing real situations, because Jesus said that in heaven, we won't be taken in marriage because the angels aren't like that. That means that actually Christians could be allowed to be promiscuous because marriage was just a kind of temporary thing for this life. I've actually heard this one with someone who actually tried to live it. So there is a point where someone who just insists on going on like that, as their Gentile nature does mean, okay, at this stage, forgiveness does mean you are now fully excluded. It doesn't mean you have to kind of keep going, okay, come on back in, ruin another family by having another affair. We don't have to go. It's not as foolish as that. But when we try to draw the hard and fast lines, it's a complicated pastoral matter in a messy world, I suppose what I'm driving at. So there you go. My thanks for watching. So I've probably raised far more. Oh, what do we do with this then? Than I've solved. It is one of those passages. I've always found a tricky one to address because I've heard it too often taken the legalistic way, which is as soon as I feel a bit offended by somebody, I've kind of told them I'm offended. It's not really to try and win them over, it's just to tell them so I can move on to stage 2, which is to find 2 people who agree with me to go and also tell them how awful they are. And then if they still reacting to me, then say, well, now we're going to make it an issue for the whole church, and so we shame in front of the whole church. That shame in front of the whole community is something that is very common. It's a cultural phenomenon that actually whole cultures get typified by how quickly they go to shaming in front of the whole community. And what Jesus is saying was, while it's not an inappropriate thing, but there needs to be a process of trying to win over, trying to bring different perspectives in, trying to find what we can agree on, because what we will agree on, God will work with, and we can move forwards on those bases. And by his Spirit, he will start to transform us and lead us into a better place. And if we look for that witness that aren't just human witnesses, but sometimes the supernatural witnesses, what we find is that the Lord leads his church, a church that is getting it wrong, but getting it wrong with the right heart attitude, the gifts of the Spirit, the grace of the Spirit, the power of what he's done in the cross, and actually the testimony of Jesus' words somehow lead us to a place where we are actually finding greater truth. That feels like in the last sentence I probably said it as clear as I could now. But anyway, would anyone like to ask any questions? Having opened a nice can of worms.
Yeah, I've got one, Chris, and I really enjoyed this. I've taken lots of notes, and I think I'll probably go back and actually record this on audio to keep.
Yeah.
I think the things that you've covered here would probably bring a lot of relief to a lot of people who've been on the receiving end of this sort of exclusionary agenda that's usually tacked onto this. And it's like you say, it's a formula for escalation. And I remember one case where someone had come with his witness and everything else, and the guy then sort of did almost like a countersuit against him, bringing his, one witness, and then and it was all about winning arguments rather than actually just getting to the root of what
the
started
winning
it.
your brother, which is right at the beginning, is the win your brother. And I think to understand part of what in trying to get across the Old Testament and why it was such a common principle, is that understanding, is to understand that it was supposed to be a restraint from too speedy justice and judgment being distributed. Was the idea of the 2 or 3 is part of actually what makes it not something you can be too quick with. It needs to really be seen in a broader kind of context. So Jesus is operating within that flow, which is about the slowing down, and then you put it in the context of this passage, which is all about grace towards those who are simple in their understanding and faith, not as mature as you are, and then to what comes next, which is all about realizing how much you've been forgiven for, means you ought to be more tolerant with those who are also being forgiven. When you put it in that flow, it's turned around, it's turned upside down from the way we often see it or have it presented.